All right, imagine a stack of crinkled club newsletters, or a shoebox of unlabeled photos, or a varsity warm up from a team that doesn't exist anymore. Where most people might see clutter, today's guest sees a map, a way to trace how fencing in the US became what it is, and how immigration, identity, and geopolitics shaped the sport on and off the strip. I'm Brian Wendell, and this is First to 15. Our guest is Alyssa Hirsch, a third year PhD student at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, who studies 20th century U.S. fencing history and its Soviet intersections. She fenced varsity at Wayne State from 2017 to 2021, earned her BA in history there, her MA in history at Purdue in 2023, and now she spends her days turning these sources into living stories. So we're going to start with how a varsity fencer even became a fencing historian, then dive into some of the stories that she's been unearthing, and then finish with some advice maybe for those who want to preserve their fencing stories in their own community. So, hey, Alyssa, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Brian. Thank you so much for having me. That was an awesome introduction. I was
Well,
grinning ear to
you've got an
ear.
awesome story. We're
Thank you.
excited. So, I mean, what got you into studying fencing history? You have a background in the sport, but not everybody is like curious about what's been going on before them.
So, um, there's a couple forays and like ways I got into wanting to study the history itself.
Mm-hmm.
So, before I went to college, I actually fenced at Renaissance Fencing Club under Anatoly Senik.
Nice.
Um,
That's in Michigan, for those who don't know, right?
yeah. And he would sometimes give the odd story about what life was like in the Soviet Union because that's where he came from and he was involved in sport there. I thought it was really interesting because it was so unlike anything I had ever heard of growing up. Like when I was a little kid, like I was the person like when like little kids play soccer, I would sit in the goalie and I'd play with dandelions. That's the kind of kid I was. So to hear Anatoly's lived experiences was so fascinating to me and I wanted to know more. Then in 11th grade, I was given an assignment where I could write a historical essay on anything I wanted. And so I wanted to kind of push the bounds and be like, well, it can't be anything. So I asked my history teacher, I was like, can I write about Soviet fencing history? And to my surprise, he said yes. So I, as a 17-year-old, was like clumsily like not just going through the primary sources, but also trying to learn about like physical culture and go through the historiography. And me looking back on it now, it was a mess, but I was so proud of myself to be able to do that. And I had probably the most fun I've ever had in a history class writing that paper.
And so you mentioned primary sources. Like, what were some of the things that you initially used to create that, 11th grade paper that maybe, informed your research methodology later on?
I One source that stands out to me because this is a while ago.
Sure, sure.
I actually I interviewed Anatoly. It was not my best interview, but I did get a lot of information and it made me want to work at that skill of oral history or
Mm-hmm.
interviewing because there are a lot of coaches in the US that I do want to interview for my dissertation, and part of those skills are like building that rapport and being able to like kind of like doing this podcast, like being able to like be friendly and have them feel like they're in a safe place where like they can talk, and
Mm-hmm.
also to be like considerate of them. So really doing that and also knowing like what to listen for as a historian.
Sure.
Yeah.
When did you feel like you became an athlete historian, a fencing historian? Was there a moment when you're like, okay, this is more than just a project where I'm doing maybe a little bit above and beyond what the teacher wanted, but now this is actually like my passion.
That would be my senior year at Wayne State. I
Okay.
was writing my honors capstone project, and I wanted to write about the history of discrimination in American fencing from like the 1700s until 1950.
Mm-hmm.
I did feel more like a historian because I was going into this was also during COVID, but I did feel like a historian because I was able to seek out the primary sources I wanted online.
Yep.
And and another big part of being a historian is it's not just going through these primary sources, but also through like connecting it to broader trends in history. So something that I have to do in my program is I'm not just a fencing historian. I have to put my work and the stories I'm teasing out from these primary sources. I have to fit them within this broader stretch of U.S. history, or
Sure.
immigration history, or U.S. Soviet history, and that has been it's been hard, and it's something that like I can always improve on. But it's so rewarding when I have a breakthrough, and I'm like, oh, that's why I'm reading all these books.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, these events aren't happening in a vacuum, right? So there's you have to consider that context. So considering that your work touches on immigration, identity, and geopolitics, like you said, is there an example of a fencing story that kind of opens a door to a bigger American story? Like what's something that you like to point to that is very indicative of its time within American history?
Something I really enjoy coming back to is the 1956 Olympics. And in the
Mm.
aftermath of that, a lot of Hungarian fencers came to the United States, and they actually ended up settling in the Bay Area. And a lot of people, like within that history, they know, oh, Sports Illustrated organized a Freedom Press tour. Basically, so the context of those games in Melbourne, they happened about 3 weeks or a month after the Hungarian Revolution, which, for those who don't know, and this is drawing, it's good practice for me to recall this. So basically, in response to Hungary not wanting a Soviet installed leader, they
Mm-hmm.
rebelled, and then Stalin sent in tanks into Budapest to crush it. And then 3 weeks later, these Hungarian athletes had to go participate in these Olympics. A lot of them did not feel safe going back. And so Sports Illustrated organized this Freedom Press tour to basically be like, hey, if you guys want to tour around the United States, you can. And a lot of them after the tour were like, oh, this looks like a good place to live. I'm going to live here. And it's for me looking at immigration, it's not just like the how they got over and got in. It's how they settled and like made a place for themselves. How like their story became interwoven in this fabric of American history is what's really interesting to me.
Yeah, that's super fascinating. We're lucky in fencing to have coaches, especially who come from so many different backgrounds and countries. You know, they might not have been born in the U.S., but found their way here. And I just imagine there's stories like that. You know, in dozens, if not hundreds, of clubs across the country. Right? It like opens this whole new door. So, Alyssa, can you explain your dissertation? Like, if you were to give kind of an elevator pitch to a non fencer, is there a kind of a 1 minute version of your dissertation and what you've been studying?
Yeah, so basically what I'm planning on doing for my dissertation is looking at how fencers after the collapse of the Soviet Union
Mm-hmm.
came to the US and like found themselves within the country by like finding jobs at these fencing clubs, and also looking at how some athletes like they went to fence at colleges in the aftermath of the Soviet collapse and how they were able to
Mm-hmm.
like make a place for themselves there. And there's like themes of identity, like how does one define themselves as Soviet and when do they identify as American? And
Mm-hmm.
it's different for every person. And I think finding those differences and the why for each person is really interesting, and how fencing kind of serves as a path to like feel at home. Because I mean, for me, if I were to pack up and move to a new country, the first thing I would do after finding like a place to live is looking for the fencing club,
Sure, yeah.
because it's something I know, it's something I love doing, and if I'm like adapting to like this completely new place, I'm going to want something familiar to hang on to. And that would be my reason, and there's a whole bunch of different reasons other people could have had for like seeking out these fencing clubs, and I want to learn about that. I think it's really interesting.
So, what makes this? I know with dissertations, you want to cover ground that other researchers haven't covered, and this certainly qualifies. So, what makes this so niche, like this topic? Why is it so? Why is this ground so uncovered?
Well, at least within academia, not a lot of people have written about fencing within the 20th century. There have been people who have written about fencing like in the early modern era with like the like French and Italian dueling schools.
Mm-hmm.
But I and also the fact that it is fencing within like the field of sports history, there aren't a lot, if any others other than me, who are doing like academic fencing history. There are other like non-academic historians whose work like I would not be here today without, like Andy Shaw and Doug Nichols. And if I forget to mention someone, I'm sorry, but like I'm like blanking. Oh,
Yeah.
Sarah Cass.
Mm-hmm.
But like their work and what they have done through like collecting and preserving sources, conducting oral history, my work would not be what it is today without them.
What are some of those other sources that are in your toolbox? I'm thinking like magazines. I know that USA Fencing published a magazine for most of its existence. Club files, oral histories, like you said, other archives. Like, how are you tracking these things down? What's your process?
So my process for that is, so I do use the American Fencing magazine. I also use the other various fencing publications like Veteran Fencers Quarterly.
Mm-hmm.
I I trying to go back through my repository because I just did a research trip. Photographs are really helpful, and also advertisements, looking
Hmm.
at what was like being advertised, what did people see as a need, and what people saw as profitable to this fencing community. Looking at not just advertisements for fencing products, but also for camps. For instance, like there would be an advertisement for a fencing camp in Europe, and thinking about why would that be attractive to American fencers. And also, so I went to the Bay Area this summer to do research, and I wasn't just looking at the West Coast fencing archives. I was also looking at things in the Hoover Institute,
Hmm.
which is a very large collection of sources from the Soviet Union and Russia. So also looking at how people like settled outside of fencing to see if fencing bucks the trend or not. Um, and something my advisor is encouraging me to do is also to look at where in like where they end up settling, not just like the fencing club they end up at, but where they end up living, like the neighborhoods, to also really get a sense of what was life like.
Is there something that has really surprised you so far in your research that you weren't expecting? Obviously, you went in with, a very sizable knowledge base, but as you encounter some of these sources that you went in search of, anything that has surprised you or that you didn't expect?
Something I did not expect, and this was for a previous paper that I wrote about how the Soviet Union got to be really good. It was my first year paper. I called it Game Recognizes Game. I was surprised at how in the American Fencing magazine there was not a lot of animosity towards Soviet fencers,
Hmm.
especially during like the hotter points of the Cold War. In fact, they were actually something that really stands out to me was a recap from the 1967 World Championships in Montreal, where there were coaches who were like American coaches who were following around the Soviet coaches, asking them for advice on what to do. They would watch the Soviet coaches give saber lessons and take like notes on what they were doing. So the fact that there was like almost like friendly relationships at times during the
Hmm.
Cold War, when previously what we're taught is that, oh, the US and Soviets hated each other, it opens up questions of who is just like yes, there were points of like tension and animosity, but were there areas where that wasn't the case? Are we like what can we benefit from looking things at not from a perspective other than the nation state to nation state level?
Yeah, I really like that. Yeah, maybe, leave that to the political leaders in Washington to, to deal with that type of thing. And when we're actually out there fencing, we can be friends even if the name on the back of our LeMay is different. I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, exactly. Because and then it was surprising at first, but then it started to click and how easily I made friends within the sport, like from all over the country. It didn't matter where they came from, like race, like gender, creed. Like if we got on and we had fun fencing each other, we were buddies.
Yeah.
And that like appreciation for if your opponent is really good, that does kind of transcend the they're a Soviet, but like the American fencers are watching, they'd be like, wow, this guy's really good. We should do some of what they're doing, some of their techniques.
Yeah. Yeah.
And and I I like seeing stuff like that because when it's just person to person, there's a lot more of an opportunity to make a friend rather than like being dictated by like political leaders.
Yeah. Game recognizes game, like you said. I think that's.
Exactly.
I see how you came up with the title. So obviously you've got a lot of experience with collegiate fencing, both personally and academically. What have you learned about how universities have shaped, access and identity and the sports growth in this country?
Ooh. Hang on, can you repeat that? Sorry, I'm like trying to.
Yeah. So
Sorry.
college fencing is a big part of the American fencing story, obviously. So have you learned and seen examples of how universities have helped the sport's growth, which we're continuing to see today as a motivation for a lot of people to join the sport is the chance to fence in college, right?
Yeah. So my experience with Wayne State is I think it's like typical to Wayne State. So back when I was fencing, there were a mix of walk-ons, which bringing new people into the sport, and they
Hmm.
would train alongside like really top-notch, like world-class fencers. Like for instance, my freshman year, the men's captain was Ziad El Sisi,
Yeah, yeah,
which it was so cool just getting to train with him even for that 1 year. He was very nice, and he seemed like a superstar, like in the way he carried himself. So to have that and like a figure like that training alongside people who were walk-ons and people who had experience fencing, it didn't matter. Like there wasn't any kind of like snobbery or people being like, "Oh, I'm a better fencer than you, so I'm gonna like just ignore you." It was a group of people coming together to represent that university and to help each other out because they were all one team. And I think that's something really cool and unique about college fencing.
yeah. I love that. How about some of the underrepresented groups in fencing's history? Obviously, for the longest time, this sport was dominated by white men, right? And
Yeah.
it took a while for women to be able to even fence saber, for example, which
Yeah.
surprises some of the newer people in our sport. And obviously, the sport is becoming more racially diverse as well, which we love to see. But looking from a historical lens, what have you found about you know, these underrepresented groups within fencing and how maybe we've come to grips with that not so savory part of our past.
Yeah. So the biggest barrier to entry for fencing for a lot of history and is a bit of a barrier now is
Hmm.
class.
Sure.
And within US history, class can be kind of a way to restrict people of certain like racial backgrounds. And this isn't unique to fencing. This is actually a phenomenon that can be recorded across a lot of athletic clubs in the 20th century where they would be deliberate in restricting things based on class and race, and eventually those
Hmm.
racial barriers went away, but the class barriers were still in place. Um, I think that initiatives like the Peter Westbrook Foundation
Hmm.
have been really instrumental in kind of closing that gap of underrepresentation. Something that I haven't seen a lot of is indigenous representation in the sport.
Hmm.
And because there are a couple indigenous history scholars at my university, and David Beck and Rosalind Lapierre, if you're watching this, hi. Sometimes uh, Dave Beck, he'll come up to me, he'll be like, "Oh, how's fencing going? Are there any? Is the Haudenosaunee Nation sending anyone?" And I'm like, "No, I'm
Hmm.
sorry."
It's
But I
interesting,
mean,
yeah.
but it's something that's also not as considered. If I And here I go. Every time I discuss something, I get a new idea for something to add to my dissertation or a project, and then I remember I can't do everything.
Right.
But that's kind of also why I want to put myself out there, and hopefully other people get into doing fencing history, so they can pick up the torch and fill those gaps that like I make.
Yeah, and there's like thousands of potential routes you could take through this giant archive, some of which hasn't even been uncovered yet. You know, might be sitting in some club's closet right in the very back in a box. And this is like a secret, not secret, but it's a process to unlock. Um, that brings me to my next question, which is about some of the sources that you've come across, the physical items. Is there something that stands out to you as a favorite moment, like a postcard that you found, or a roster, or a footnote in some magazine or caption that you were like, oh wow, you know, it'd be very easy to have just overlooked this, and this kind of changed the game for me in some small way.
Yeah, I think my favorite source that I've come across is actually it was in the University of Illinois libraries. It was a Soviet fencing manual
Hmm.
published in 1958, and I found it my first year, and I was also a first year Russian student. So I went up to my Russian teacher and she helped me to translate it.
Cool.
And in it, I was actually able to find out a lot about how the Soviet Union got to be really good within the 20th century. It turns out they learned a lot from the Hungarians. Like they did a training camp with them and would follow them around and be like, "Tell me everything I'm doing wrong in great detail."
Hmm.
Um, Sometimes my Russian teacher, she'd be like, "Oh, this is like typical like state propaganda. We don't have to translate it." And I'm like, there could be something interesting there. What does the state think it's important to say
Yeah.
to like get this published? And where and is are there any moments within this book that kind of deviate from that or contradict what's
Hmm.
mandated by the state? So there was so much, and it was a blast to translate that because a lot of like questions and thoughts that I had growing up and through undergrad and my master's were answered by that book.
That's cool. And it
Thank
was
you.
just sitting in the library. You might have been the first, you know, to look at it in decades, right?
Yeah.
That's cool. All right, so for our next section, let's talk about how others can get involved because you said it earlier, like you shouldn't be the only fencing historian out there, and you're not. Andy Shaw and a bunch of the others that you mentioned have done a great job, non academically, but still, but preserving and promoting the history of fencing. George Mason is another one who has
Yes.
made a big archive of fencing results through the years, and been very eager to share it with others, coming to NACS and showing some of his collection. But back to my original question, what does being a fencing historian actually look like for people who are interested in that? Like, what's a week in the life of Alyssa Hirsch? When you're doing a lot of research.
So when I'm doing a lot of research, I guess, well, my weeks now are a lot of reading for preliminary exams, which are the big make or break for like a person in a history PhD program.
Mm.
So it's doing readings for that. I'm also TAing and and also like doing research on the side, kind of collecting like, okay, who do I want to interview? What are going to be some good spots to go to? And also going through my own database of what I've already collected and done research on
Hmm.
for, okay, what can I take more notes on? What is there something I overlooked? Um, and then I try and cap off my days at like 4. Like I start early, I end at 4, so that way I can get home, hang out with my pet birds, and like cook dinner and
Nice.
relax. And on Thursdays, I go to the fencing club, and I like talking with the older guys there. And like for anyone who's like who's interested in fencing history, talk to your coaches
Mm-hmm.
and like ask them what was fencing like back in the day. And sometimes the stories they tell can lead you into like really interesting research avenues. Like for me, just hearing the stories from Anatoly
Yeah.
actually shaped my entire career path. So thank you, Anatoly.
Well,
Like
that's
genuinely, this helped me find like my life's passion, and I would not be here today without Anatoly. So thank you, coach.
That's terrific. So you kind of touched on the next question, which is what advice you have for those aspiring historians. So it sounds like the first one is start at your own club, right? And talk to the individuals there, those who have been around the sport for a long time and might have some interesting stories. But how else might people find material that allows them to dig into the history of this sport?
Um, there is a website called American Fencing Archive, and that has a
Okay.
lot of digital issues of the American Fencing magazine.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of my research was drawing from those issues and just reading through them. Um, Sometimes to learn about fencing history, you have to read books that aren't about fencing history.
Hmm.
Um, and even some like general sports history books because they can serve as starting off points for, okay, this is a broad overview of what sports were like. For instance, Melvin Edelman's A Sporting Time talks about sports, excuse me, sports history in New York during the 1800s and talks about modernization, how these athletic clubs modernize their sport. And then you can use it as a starting off point to be like, okay, if I wanted to do research, I can go to these clubs in New York City.
Mm-hmm.
Now, not every club might have historical material, like stacks of like books and articles, but sometimes the posters that they have,
Hmm.
like that are hanging up on the walls, because at Renaissance Fencing Club, when I went there, there would be big posters of certain events and signatures from people from the club who participated in that. That's really valuable
That's cool.
because what it shows is who was associated with this club and how does the club honor them and how they contributed to the club. And you combine that with talking to people as well as like reading the articles and connecting it back to US history. And that's how you do fencing history.
That's great. Yeah, it goes back to what you were saying that like if you have a specific time period you want to focus on with fencing history, you need to understand what's happening in American and world history, even the sports context, like you said. I think that's really smart. So let's finish with our kind of quick hits section. I've got like five quick questions for you that we can have a little bit of fun as we wrap up here. The first one is like, let's say that time machines were invented. Is there a bout or event or location from fencing history that you would visit for a day? Like, what would that be?
I would have to say, there was an instance at the 1956 Melbourne Games where this one Soviet general who was like in charge of sports, Popov, he had a luncheon inside of a commandeered Hungarian warship.
Hmm.
And I think like there was an article about it in the US Fencing magazine where I forget off I hang on. Actually, my Zotero is too clogged. So I can't find the exact author, but it was written about in the captain's report how they went to this luncheon and some of the Polish fencers who were there were uncomfortable. And to be in that room, that's like a huge like stew pot about to bubble over of
Mm-hmm.
tensions and seeing how. And also another reason why I study fencing history is because it's a good way to see how ordinary people are affected by like these big like world events. So being able to be in that room and see how these people who just wanted to come to Melbourne and fence and have been training for this are grappling with these geopolitical issues, I think it would be very uncomfortable, but I think it would be really valuable for research just to like see and like get a sense for the
Yeah,
vibes in there.
be a fly on the wall in there. That's great. Okay, question two. If you were to be able to communicate to every club owner out there, even those who used to own a club that maybe doesn't exist anymore, what would you tell them about like how to preserve all the material that they have and make it more accessible and make sure it's around for the next generation of researchers as well?
Um, what I would advise is digitizing your sources and
Mm-hmm.
putting them into a cloud. That being said, digitization is a really lengthy and expensive process.
Sure.
Um, a lot of archivists at University of Illinois have like complained about having to digitize everything. But if you don't have a lot of stuff, I would recommend digitizing it and have it uploaded to a website, but also have a backup in case that website gets taken down.
Mm.
Um, that is what I have.
Yeah, I think that's
Um,
smart.
someone who is someone who's really good at like archiving. It was like Andy Shaw, but also Doug Nichols. When I
Mm-hmm.
went, he was like very organized and methodical with how he preserved the sources, and I liked seeing that.
Yeah. Okay, question three. What one object from fencing history would you put in a glass case and, make sure that everybody had a chance to see it? It can be something that you've actually seen yourself or that you just know is out there somewhere.
Hmm. I would probably put a trophy from the Martini and Rossi Cup.
Hmm.
Like that was like a quintessential like World Cup event for a while, and I think having that piece of physical culture would be like really good to preserve and showcase.
I like that. Okay, number four. When you're like deep into research mode, uh, what kind of music are you listening to, or
Oh
is it
man.
silent, or how do you focus on that? Because having done research myself, I know that you got to just lock in and be,
Oh yeah.
immersed for several hours.
So some lately I've been doing is I just go onto YouTube and I look up classical music for studying,
Oh, nice.
or I put on, you know, the one song on the Incredible soundtrack, "Life's Incredible Again,"
I think so.
like
Yeah.
the da 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 da
Oh, yes. I
da
didn't
da.
know it was called that, but yes.
Yeah, it's I put that on a loop. And
I
it
like that.
like it makes me feel happy, and it makes me feel like I'm chugging right along.
That's great.
Or if I'm writing, sometimes I'll put on music from the time period I'm writing about. Like if I'm writing about something from the 80s, I'll put on like 80s
Hmm.
synthwave, or the
Mm-hmm.
50s, I'll put on like 50s like swing music or
Get you in
something just to
the
like,
right vibe.
yeah.
That's great. Okay, last one. Who would you invite to dinner? Someone from history, a fencer, coach, anybody who you'd love to invite to dinner. And as a bonus question, like, what would you ask them about? What's the first thing you'd want to ask?
Oh my gosh, that's Helene Mayer.
Okay.
So, for those who don't know Helene Mayer, she was a fencer from Germany, half Jewish. She won her first gold medal um, at the Amsterdam Games in 1928, and she was 17. Then in
Hmm.
1932, she goes to the Los Angeles Games. She gets news that her boyfriend died in an accident, and that affects her performance, and she finishes fifth. She then lives in California for a bit and is teaching at schools around the Bay Area, like Mills College, I believe. Yeah, Mills. And while she's teaching, um, the Nazis are rising to power. Hitler actually revokes her citizenship because
Hmm.
she's half Jewish. As it gets closer to the 1936 games, the Nazis are scrambling because they've gotten rid of all their Jewish athletes. For instance, there was a Jewish high jumper. She cleared a jump that would have gotten Germany the gold medal, and the Nazis were like, "Oh, not good enough. You're off the team."
Hmm.
And so the International Olympic Committee is like, "Hey, um, Germany, we noticed there have been some troubling things happening with Jewish people. If you don't have at least one Jewish person on your team, you cannot host these games."
Hmm.
And so hosting these games was very important for Nazi Germany because hosting an Olympics means you can prove your national superiority on the
Sure.
world stage and assert yourself as like a dominant global superpower. Um, so the Nazis reached out to Helene and they said, "Will you fence for us?" Because this was before the era where you could fence for a country that you had citizenship with. It had to be your birth country that you
Hmm.
represented in the Olympics. Um, and Helene agreed. And so I guess having her over for dinner, um, I'd want to ask her what was going through her head when she decided that.
Yeah,
Was
totally.
she like reading outpouring from like the Jewish community? What did she have connection to that? And historians, they can make inferences about what she may have thought, but I'd want to hear it straight from her, and
Yeah.
also what life was like after, because she got the silver medal in 1936 and the Nazis are like, "All right, you didn't win, bye."
Hmm.
And she returned to the US and eventually ended up living back in Germany, and where she died fairly young. I want to say maybe in her like 40s or 50s.
Hmm. That's it.
Yeah. But like
That's super
just
interesting.
yeah, I've struggled with like trying to understand her for a while. And part of that as a historian is to recognize that the historical actors you study are people.
Yeah.
Yeah, like for instance, sometimes I'll be like, "Oh, I want to eat healthier." And then I drive to McDonald's and I get like a quarter pounder meal. A historian looking at that would be like, "She said she wants to eat healthy. Why did she do that?" That
Right.
doesn't make any sense. But it's like people don't make sense all the
People are
time.
people. Yeah.
So learning about her has been a real like a phenomenal lesson in recognizing that people are people throughout history.
Hmm. I think that's really interesting. And That's a great place to leave it, I think. Alyssa, thank you so much for opening the doors to fencing and the side of fencing a lot of us never see, which is, often these stories hiding in boxes and basements and internet archives. So to our listeners, if today sparked an idea, ask your club what they might have. If you can help them organize some of that, a great service project idea for high schoolers out there. See what's sitting around. And maybe if you have a research assignment in school, make it about fencing, right? Like Alyssa did. And you can see where you might end up. That's how our sport remembers the past as we move into this exciting future. And then also, if you enjoyed this episode, be sure to follow First to 15 and leave us a quick rating or review. It helps more fencers and maybe even some future fencing historians find our podcast. So I'm Brian Wendell and Alyssa Hirsch. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you at the next tournament, I'm sure.
All right, thank you so much. Have a good
Thanks.
one.